What's up guys, welcome back to another video on wavy and glossy Yu-Gi-Oh cards. In this video, I'll be giving a little bit of history about the concept of first print, which was the term originally used to describe wavy print LOB cards like this Exodia head you see on the left. And I'll also be pointing out the issues not only with that theory, but also with the later theory that glossy cards came first. So if you haven't done so already, please do go back and watch the first couple of videos I made, where I went through in detail what wavy and glossy cards look like. It's been about 10 years now since the Old School Expert, whose channel I'm sure you're all familiar with, first noticed that there were these two different printings of LOB, and his decision to label wavy as first print was based primarily on the conception that the wavy print cards were lower quality than their glossy counterparts. So if I take these two up close, the first thing that people noticed was that the wavy ultra rares often had this lower title compared to the glossy ones, which had the normal position. But there was also the fact that the wavy cards often displayed some kind of discoloration, whereas the glossy cards pretty much all have the same color. And finally, the wavy cards have this pitted texture to the surface, whereas the glossy cards have that higher gloss surface, which is more or less flat. So the assumption was made that these lower quality wavy cards must have been the first printing, and that the higher quality glossy versions were the later second printing, once they'd realized the mistakes with the first one and had time to correct them. And this was sometimes also backed up by the misconception that glossy cards were made on the same cardstock as later sets and later unlimited cards, which, as I showed in my last video, is not actually accurate. After it emerged about 10 years ago, the term first print grew pretty rapidly in popularity with collectors. I've drawn up a little timeline here to give a demonstration of how it unfolded. So around 2010, 2011 was when the term first started being used, and within a few years of that, I'd say 2014, more collectors started to hear about it, realize it for themselves, and become aware of these differences. And then over the years after that, people gradually started actually paying a premium for first print cards, as they were called at the time. By 2017, I'd say that difference was about 10 to 20% depending on the card. But that then snowballed pretty rapidly over the next year, and by mid-2018, you had people paying almost double for some wavy print cards such as Red Eyes Black Dragon over the glossy version. And when that big price difference started to emerge, people started to ask more questions as well about how we really knew that the wavy versions were the first print. And from that point, the theory of first print actually unraveled pretty quickly, because people realized that pretty much the only evidence behind it had been the fact that the cards showed lower print quality and quality control than the glossy versions. And there was no reason why that had to mean they were first print. So, for example, if the glossy versions actually came first, then the wavy versions could be a later printing used to fill in the demand, and maybe the lower quality control was just due to the fact that they no longer had the good cardstock left, and they had to print on a tighter schedule because they needed to get the boxes to stores more quickly. So leading on from that, people actually then started to formulate more theories about glossy coming first, because a lot of the things added up in the favor of glossy rather than wavy. And I'm going to go through that now. So the first piece of evidence, which is probably the biggest piece of evidence for the theory, is the fact that in glossy print, the entire set of LOB exists, including the retail secret rare, Gaia the Dragon Champion. Whereas in wavy print, every single box is a hobby box, and so you cannot pull the Gaia the Dragon Champion from a wavy box. And we know from order sheets that stores were given as posters when the game came out that they were capable of ordering both hobby and retail boxes right from the time the game came out. So if Gaia the Dragon Champion was already part of the set then it figures that glossy had to come first. And the next piece of evidence which was used to support this theory was the fact that in the starter decks that first came out in 2002, Yugi and Kaiba, all of the first edition cards are glossy print, like this Dark Magician you see here, and wavy prints only existed for the unlimited cards. So it was assumed from that, again, that the glossy versions must have come first if wavy did not exist for the first edition starter deck cards, but it did exist for the unlimited. And another reason which was cited was the fact that the first card ever released in the TCG, which is this Summoned Skull with the sample text across the back, which was released in December 2001, given to stores as a demonstration of what the cards in the TCG would look like. is printed on a pretty glossy looking cardstock. And that was assumed as a reason why glossy must have come first if the first card in the TCG was glossy. Now I'll show later in the video that this is not actually a glossy card, but for now I'm just going through the reasons why this theory became popular, and that's one of them. And the last two things that were used to support this theory, I unfortunately do not have examples of here to show you in this video, but they are as follows. So the first thing is that wavy print boxes have a smaller lettering in the bottom right hand corner saying first edition, when compared to glossy boxes, which have the larger first edition that overlaps with the logo in the center of the box. So wavy boxes have that smaller lettering, and so do all of the later sets that came out. So it made people think that the glossy box with the bigger lettering must have been the first release, and then the wavy box with the smaller lettering is the second release, in line with the other boxes that came out afterwards. And the final piece of evidence is the fact that the uncut sheets we have for LOB first edition, which are all glossy, are dated to the 11th of Feb 2002, or at least the one I have seen is dated to that date. And the game didn't come out until March 8th. So if the glossy sheets are dated to before the release of the game, then you assume they have to be first print. Now, before I go any further, I thought it was worth pointing out that this theory that glossy cards came first, even if it's not perfect, still has a lot more going for it than the previous theory that wavy came first, and it has a lot more legitimate evidence supporting it as well. But nonetheless, there are still issues with it, and I'm going to go through those and point them out now. So the first point I made for why glossy might have come first was the fact that it contains the secret rare Gaia the Dragon Champion, whereas the wavy set does not. Now, there is actually such thing as a wavy Gaia the Dragon Champion, which I showed you in my first video, but that card wasn't pulled from a wavy box. So I think the point still stands that retail boxes are only available in glossy print, and if they were available to order at the time of the release of the game, then glossy print cards must have come out right around that time as well. But in terms of saying whether they actually came first, this point isn't necessarily that useful, because obviously it's also possible that wavy print cards were available at the same time. So the next piece of evidence I'm going to revisit is the point I mentioned earlier, which has been stated a lot in the past, that for the starter decks that came out in 2002 in first edition, all of the hollows are glossy print. Now, I mentioned this in my last video, but I'm going to put it again here because it is really important to realize that not all of them are glossy print. So there's no such thing as a wavy print first edition starter deck Yugi or starter deck Kaiba card, but there are such things as these cards, which the one on the right here is an example of, where they do not feature the same gloss on the surface that a first edition glossy print card does. So they're still pretty similar to glossy on the whole, but whereas all LOB cards are like this Dark Magician on the left and have that high gloss to the surface, a fairly high percentage, I'd say around 15 to 20% of the first edition starter deck Yugi cards have this rougher texture to the surface, even though they're mostly still glossy print. And it's important because it kind of makes the glossy came first timeline a little more complicated, because if these are a separate printing, which is presumably later because starter deck Yugi was released a few weeks after LOB, it makes you wonder why first edition LOB exists in wavy print and not first edition starter deck Yugi and starter deck Kaiba, because if wavy came later, you'd expect these to be the cards which existed in wavy print, and you'd expect LOB to only be glossy. And the next thing I'm going to revisit is this sample Summon Skull from 2001, which I mentioned before. So, as I said, this card is often being called a glossy print because of the fact that it has this really glossy cardstock, both front and back. But I'm going to show you a couple of cards alongside it now, which demonstrate that although it's glossy in a sense, it's not actually a glossy print. So first up, I have a first edition glossy Summon Skull from starter deck Yugi. And when you put them side by side, you can probably see that the cardstocks are pretty different. They have different colors to them, the font's a bit different, and if I show you up close, you should hopefully be able to see that the Eye of Anubis is a bit larger on the North American card, whereas this one has the smaller Eye of Anubis. And if I flip them over to the back, you should be able to see that the one on the left is a lot glossier on the back compared to the first edition version. And the reason for this, which I'm going to demonstrate now, is that this Summon Skull, which was printed in 2001, is not actually a TCG card at all. It is printed on OCG cardstock. So on the right here, I have a Dark Elf common, which was printed around the same time as this Summon Skull. And you should be able to see that these cards, unlike the last two I showed you, match up extremely well when it comes to the level of gloss on the surface, the thickness of font, and also on the back, the level of gloss they display. So although this skull on the right is in a sense a glossy card, it's not glossy print. And so that's important because if it was, that would be pretty good evidence to say that glossy came first because this was printed in 2001. But since it's not, it doesn't really give you any evidence either way to whether wavy or glossy were the first printing in the TCG. Now I'll come to the last couple of points, which again I unfortunately do not have anything on hand to demonstrate. So the first point, again, which I should mention, is that fact that the glossy print boxes have the thick font for first edition on the boxes, whereas the wavy ones have the small text. So I think it's a valid interpretation to say that that means that they came first, but it's also important to point out that there's no particular reason why that has to be the case. So for example, if you look at the sets PGD, MFC, and then DCR, which all came out 2003, 2004, both Pharaonic Guardian and Dark Crisis have the same design where the first edition logo goes bottom right, but Magician's Force in the middle, they moved it up at the top where it says English edition. And then obviously they decided that for some reason they didn't like that, and so they moved it back for the following set. So I would say there's no reason why that could not be the same situation for LOB, where they started with a small logo. Maybe they felt that it should be larger, and so they moved it to a slightly different position and made the text bigger. And then they decided for some reason that they didn't like it, or maybe it was just an accident that it got moved back to the first position again. So it's another important point to mention, just in terms of showing that whilst that's one interpretation of it to say that glossy came first, it's not actually the only interpretation. The last point to revisit is the thing I mentioned earlier about the uncut glossy sheets that we have being dated to Feb 2002, which is before the release of the game. So I think this is actually a really interesting point because people have often used it to say that glossy came first because it was in production before the game was released. But I think it actually points to the exact opposite direction because when you look at that date, Feb 2002, you compare it to other trading card games, the normal situation with printing a new set in other card games where we have evidence is that the print run begins probably 6 months before distribution of the product and it ends about 3 months before the release date. So if that were the case, you would expect the first printing of the TCG cards to have already started at the tail end of 2001 and to be finished by Jan 2002 at the latest. And so this date of Feb 2002, actually it's hard to interpret, but it could well mean that glossy is a later printing because those boxes which were being made in February almost certainly would not be ready in local stores within less than a month. And with that being said, we have reached the end of this video. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, comment something, whatever you're able to do to help the video reach a wider audience. I really appreciate. And of course, stay tuned for the next and final video in this series where I will tie up all the loose ends from this video and give my verdict on whether I think there was a first print, and if so, what it was.